Well, joining me now is Bryan Clark, a Senior Fellow, Director of the Centre of Defence Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute, a retired US Navy officer and submariner for 2.5 decades. Bryan served as Chief Engineer on nuclear submarines, worked as Chief of Naval Operations Staff and one of the leading US voices in naval warfare. Welcome to France 24, Bryan. It's great to have you with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's begin. The US posture on the Strait of Hormuz, first of all, the Arabian Sea seems to be changing frequently. I'm trying to keep across it. I don't know if you are the same. I put the radio on in the morning, trying to understand that it's different perhaps from previous orders from the president, particularly this week. Protect freedom one day, that project the next, it's paused. Do you think this is causing a big headache right now for US CENTCOMs, the command teams in Tampa, Florida, in Al Ubaid, in the Gulf as well?
I do think it's going to be challenging because what they're facing is a constant changing set of demands and objectives that they're supposed to meet. So, for example, up until this last week, they were focused on the blockade and preventing shipping going in and out of the strait, going to Iran. And that was pretty straightforward. As you could see, they were pretty effective at disabling ships that attempted to run the blockade, and they had turned away 50 to 60 ships over the last several weeks. And then they are now pivoting to having to defend shipping that's trying to make its way out of the strait. But the U.S. was very careful not to frame this as an escort mission because they didn't want to be responsible for actually protecting every ship individually, sort of in a bodyguard type of approach. They wanted to focus on an area defense that they would hope would be sufficient to protect shipping overall as it made its way out. And that just pivots a lot of resources away from the blockade mission now to this defensive mission. And they weren't really given the full authority to proceed with the defensive mission in the way you would if you were actually trying to bodyguard ships as they make their way out. So they had to do it sort of with a limited amount of resources without getting too committed to the operation. So very challenging to execute from the commander's perspective.
This is a very important point, Bryan, and it easily missed, actually. You've called it, I think, the defence approach in the past. So rather than move into the strait and fight and eliminate the threat in the short term, perhaps the leverage Iran has is going to be for a long time. Instead of moving in and fighting, it's about reaching in and containing the threat. The idea of giving confidence to shipping, and this is going to have to be looked at again, presumably at some stage, depending on whatever happens in negotiations.
Absolutely, because even if you get Iran to agree to allowing shipping to proceed through the Strait of Hormuz, I'd be very surprised if Iran does that without asking for some kind of compensation in return. So some kind of fee or a toll being paid for passage. And then Iran always maintains the ability to start attacking shipping again. So shipping companies will need to have some kind of confidence and protection if they're going to make their way up and down the Strait of Hormuz, which means now an international mission to defend shipping in kind of this bodyguard fashion, this man-on-man defense fashion for the foreseeable future, because Iran will always now have this latent threat that they can execute with very little warning.
It's also worth saying, Project Freedom, we can easily miss the fact that I think the CENTCOM quote on the current estimate of how many mariners are still stuck in the strait and around, unable to get in and out, is something like 22,000 personnel.
Right.
And is it 1,550 vessels as well? So that's an awful lot we're talking about. And it's easy to think, okay, well, this Project Freedom, it lasted, less than 2 days. But it is worth saying this is not something that would have been drawn up on the back of a fact packet. This would have taken a long time for CENTCOM, for the naval teams to draw up, to make happen.
Right. They would have had to start a large air campaign. So how they did most of the defense for Project Freedom was using aircraft, so helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, fighter aircraft that basically orbited over the Strait of Hormuz and were there to interdict any ships or missiles that came out or drones that came out to attack shipping. So it's a fairly large operation where you'd have dozens of aircraft constantly in rotation, managing that combat air patrol over the strait. And then they were combined with, as we saw, a couple of destroyers helped to guide ships out and show them where the clear path was going along the coast of Oman. But it was a pretty significant operation, and it would have required pivoting a lot of at least air resources away from the blockade mission and over to this new mission.
It was paused, as we know. I just wonder your take here that we never got to see how it could have played out. Do you think if they would have continued, it could have changed the dynamic? I mean, the power dynamic in terms of Iran's dominance, its psychological advantage.
If it was successful, I think it would have. I think the challenge the US was running into was if they weren't willing to commit ships to the escort mission, it meant that you were still going to have this potential for leakers or
Mm.
missiles or drones to get past the aircraft that were attempting to shoot them down. And maybe even boats would make it through, even though there were helicopters that were doing a pretty effective job at countering them. But this risk of leakers is why you have escort ships go with a convoy like that. And they provide that last line of defense, that bodyguard to protect the shipping. And without committing to do that, you're going to have that risk of leakers, and shipping companies will be risk averse, obviously, and they won't want to put ships at risk if there's even a 10% chance or less of a leaker getting through to their ship. And I think that was the fundamental problem, is they didn't have this willingness to use ships alongside aircraft, which would have put a lot more forces at risk. It would have been a much higher risk operation for the U.S., but it would have been necessary to get that higher level of confidence for the shipping companies. And this is why you only saw the U.S. Shipping companies take advantage of the operation and only get two ships out during it. The other problem we ran into and why it was paused in part was because Saudi Arabia refused to allow overflight and basing to support the air operation, which meant that now you don't have ships doing the escort mission. Aircraft are having to operate from farther away, and it reduces their reach. It made it much more difficult to sustain the operation, given the way the U.S. structured it.
I've been across some of your analysis, Brian. Very interesting to hear, to read, to listen to. One of the thoughts that I've got is if there was a US attempt, perhaps a wider attempt, to say we will secure the strait, that it is almost inevitable that the US vessels, military vessels, would take a hit at some stage.
Right. It's likely because it only takes one to make it through. Now, it wouldn't be necessarily catastrophic because ships have good damage control and they have a variety of self-defense systems. But at some point, eventually, some drone or missile will leak through and will add damage. The U.S. has sort of set the expectations, though, that this is a low-risk operation, and they really, I guess, they can't afford the optics of having the U.S. ship get hit, even if the damage is relatively modest, because it would show the vulnerability and the risk posed by this operation. So I think that's why the U.S. The administration chose not to put any ships in there in this escort role, and
Mm.
instead focused on using aircraft to provide this defensive umbrella, which I just think is not sufficient to give you that level of confidence that the shipping companies need, because you can get leakers, and if there's nobody there to be your bodyguard, then you're on your own, right? Once a
Mm.
leaker gets through, there's no way to engage it.
And when we hear the narrative from the war secretary, the defense secretary in the US, and from President Trump, that Iran's navy's destroyed, obliterated, there's nothing left of it, just a few wise guy boats in President Trump's terms, these speedboats. I note that your thought here is Iran has two navies, one for the military, one for the Revolutionary Guard, with these speedboats, and also so-called mini submarines that sound terrifying, let's face it, in terms of capability and stealth. But is your assessment that in terms of that threat from the Revolutionary Guard Navy, which we assume is the speedboats, and tell me if I'm correct there, those submarines, are they no longer operating?
As far as we can tell, the Midget submarines, which are based on a North Korean design, the Yono design, don't appear to be operating anymore. And then part that's because they can't remain at sea very long. They operate inside the Persian Gulf, so they don't operate out in the open ocean, and they carry three to six people. It's not very many people, but they have torpedoes, and so the idea is they get close to a ship, they launch a torpedo, and it acts essentially as a mobile mine. And those midget submarines can be very dangerous, but they can only be at sea for a few days at a time. So now we are multiple weeks into the conflict, and any of those midget submarines that were at sea would have had to have returned to port by now. And the U.S. has been attacking them when they get back into port. And so I think at this point, the midget sub threat has largely been eliminated. But I think that the bigger threat is these speedboats, because obviously it's hard to eliminate a bunch of speedboats that are in various hiding places around the coastline. And the Iranian coastline is there's a lot of areas that are relatively urbanized, like Bandar Abbas, and there's a lot of caves or caves and coves and inlets where you can hide boats. So there's a lot of boats hidden along the coastline that could make their way out, and I think it'll be difficult to really eliminate that threat entirely. And again, that's why you get to this need to have both escort ships as well as aircraft to be able to defend against them.
Have you been deployed, Brian, on a submarine in the Strait of Hormuz over the years, just to give an idea of what it's like? It's shallower waters, its operational considerations.
Yeah, the waters there are so submarine operations are very difficult in the Persian Gulf in general, just because it's only a few hundred feet deep in most places, and the salinity is highly variable because it's relatively confined waters with you know. Obviously, it's a very desert environment, so there's a lot of evaporation of the water. So it creates a lot of challenging conditions for managing the submarine's buoyancy and depth. And then because it's shallow and all because the water's warm, it just creates a very difficult acoustic environment. And submarines generally try to use their sonar to do their navigation to avoid running into anybody, for example. And that just gets more challenging inside the Persian Gulf. So we try to avoid obviously doing a lot of submarine operations inside the Persian Gulf and generally try to stay outside of it if possible. Now the Iranian Navy generally doesn't operate its larger submarines inside the Persian Gulf. They mostly stay outside, and it's really only these mini subs that the Iranians have used inside the Persian Gulf.
Mhm. There is a lot of analysis, Brian, at the moment indicating if the US does get a deal, and what comes next in the longer term, that they say, okay, we'll open the strait for now, that the leverage is always there for Iran. And it could be that, many analysts say that the US eventually kind of peel away. It could be down to European navies, those relying on oil to secure the strait. And that could be a future there, which will not look like a free-flowing, toll-free pass. And I've heard an analyst, Michael Clark, talk about a hospital pass, as they call it in rugby, to the Europeans to say, there you go, you deal with that. What's your take?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think the Iranians now have a taste for the kind of control that they're able to exert over the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. So it would seem like they're going to want to get some kind of compensation, both as sort of reparations because of the war, but also to just to extort companies that are attempting to use the strait because they can, and it's a source of income. So I think they're going to want to exert some level of control over the strait going forward. So that will be a sticking point in the negotiations because the U.S. Obviously doesn't want to seem to be compromising on that point because the strait was open before and now the war has caused it to be closed, which would just making it open again is merely a return to the status quo. And I think it's likely they're going to end up asking for something more than just a return to the status quo. Iran will want some kind of control over it. And then the other thing I think, which gets to your point about the escort mission, is the U.S. will probably not want to be involved in the long-term escort mission because the U.S. leadership will argue that they don't need the oil out of there. This is really mostly to satisfy Asian and European customers. And that's where I think you might see those Asian and European navies come in and provide that escort function, and they would work within some management scheme that the Iranians are going to have a level of control over. So it'll definitely be a worse situation in terms of the free flow of traffic compared to what we had before the war.
Give us a better understanding, Brian, as well of perhaps conversations you've had with morale amongst some of the naval forces. I'm minded of the USS Gerald R. Ford. I think the longest deployment of any warship, post Cold War period, post Vietnam War, I think 296 days at sea. Conversations you're having about the spirit, the feeling of staff.
Right. So sailors are at the point where they, like the Ford especially, are getting tired, and this has been a nearly year-long deployment for them. Sailors generally feel like if you're extended on deployment to do something useful, it's a worthwhile sacrifice, and their families feel the same way. But at a certain point, when you feel like we're kind of we don't need to be out here doing this any longer, or just reach a certain breaking point, which is usually at about the 11-month or 1 year point. People are ready to go home, and their families are ready for them to come home. So I think, regardless of how important you feel like the mission is, at about this 11-month point, you start to feel like somebody else could rotate in and take it over. Because right now, I think there's a combination of kind of questioning whether what they're accomplishing at this point because it's sort of a stalemate. And then second, the length of the deployment is just leading to them kind of reaching their breaking point in terms of morale. And that's why I think you saw the U.S. start to rotate the forward back, and they're going to probably, it sounds like they're bringing in replacements for the other carrier to follow it, and try to keep these deployments less than 10 to 11 months so you don't burn out the crew too much before you bring them home.
That is very, very interesting. Final word, Brian, on the Dark Eagle. This US hypersonic missile costs $30 million reportedly per missile, travels 5 times the speed of sound. A lot of talk in the past week about CENTCOM formally requesting its deployment for the Middle East, which would mark the first operational deployment of a US hypersonic missile weapons system. What's your take?
Well, so normally the idea behind deploying these hypersonic weapons is you would use them in a place where you've got very capable air defenses and you need that hypersonic speed to be able to circumvent the air defenses of your enemy. Here, the Iranian air defense system is largely degraded and in a lot of cases is completely neutralized. So you don't really need that hypersonic capability to be able to defeat it. And the hypersonic missile warheads are generally not any bigger than a regular bomb. So you're not getting a bigger explosive power, and they're not more penetrating than a lot of the existing bombs that the U.S. is able to deploy. So I think this is more about demonstrating for other audiences this capability is real and is viable, rather than actually doing anything operationally against the Iranians. So I would envision like this is a demonstration to kind of show the Chinese, for example, that the U.S. has now fielded this hypersonic capability and it's operational.
Brian, really, really interesting to have that analysis and context as well. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Bryan Clark, Senior Fellow Director of the Centre of Defence Concept and Technology at the Hudson Institute, who we heard as submariner for 2.5 decades and served as Chief Engineer on nuclear submarines.